Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a city that made the ancient world deeply uncomfortable and then paid for it. So dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket a little closer, and let your brain slowly power down while we drift into the warm, dusty edges of ancient history. Nothing too intense. Just a quiet little story about ambition, trade, family drama, and a city that really didn't know when to stop. We're going to spend some time with Carthage, a place that was, depending on who you ask, either a glittering hub of wealth and culture or a suspiciously successful rival that needed to be erased. And as we move along, we'll meet a few familiar overachievers, including Hannibal Barca, who, of course, thought marching elephants over mountains was a reasonable career decision. But let's not rush. This is bedtime history. We stroll, we don't sprint. So, Carthage. It began, as many questionable things do, with a royal family disagreement. The story goes that a Phoenician princess named Dido, also called Alyssa, because why have one name when you can complicate things, fled her home city of Tyre after her brother decided that murdering her husband was just efficient governance. Naturally, Dido packed her things, gathered some loyal followers, and sailed off across the Mediterranean in search of a fresh start. Because nothing says healthy coping mechanism like founding a new civilization. She eventually landed on the coast of North Africa, in what is now modern-day Tunisia. The locals, probably expecting a small settlement at best, made a deal with her. She could have as much land as she could cover with an ox hide. Now, most people would say, okay, modest village, maybe a few goats. But Dido was not most people. She cut the ox hide into extremely thin strips and laid them out to enclose a surprisingly large area. Because of course she did. This is the kind of energy Carthage was built on. Polite agreements, immediately followed by clever loopholes. And just like that, Carthage was born. Now, let's float gently forward, because cities don't become powerful overnight. Well, not officially. Carthage grew slowly at first, then not so slowly, and then in a very confident, slightly aggressive way. Positioned perfectly along Mediterranean trade routes, it became a commercial powerhouse. Ships came and went constantly, carrying metals, textiles, spices, and probably a fair amount of gossip. The Carthaginians were, above all else, traders, not philosophers, not empire builders in the traditional sense. They didn't sit around debating the nature of existence like the Greeks. They were more like, can we monetize existence? And if so, how quickly? Their navy became one of the most formidable forces in the ancient world. Not because they loved war exactly, but because protecting trade routes is much easier when you have a fleet that makes everyone else nervous. And they did this all while maintaining a very particular kind of political system. Carthage wasn't ruled by a single king for most of its history. Instead, it had a complex mix of elected officials, councils, and powerful families, which sounds balanced and democratic until you realize those powerful families tended to stay powerful. So yes, technically a republic, but also a bit of a family business. And like any long-running family business, things could get complicated. Now, while Carthage was busy becoming rich and influential, there was another rising power across the sea, Rome. At first, the relationship between Carthage and Rome was fine. Not warm, not friendly, but manageable. They signed treaties. They respected each other's territories. Everyone pretended this arrangement would last forever. It did not, because eventually both sides looked at the same piece of land, Sicily, and thought, that should probably be mine. And this, gently and without too much drama, brings us into the beginning of a long, slow-burning rivalry. But before we get into wars and strategies and elephants doing their best mountain climbing impressions, let's linger a little longer in Carthage itself. Because this wasn't just a trading hub. It was a deeply layered society, full of rituals, traditions, and, occasionally, things that made outsiders extremely uncomfortable. Carthaginian religion, for example, has a bit of a reputation. They worshipped gods like Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Their rituals were elaborate, symbolic, and, depending on your sources, possibly included practices that later historians described with a certain amount of alarm. Now, here's where things get a little tricky. Much of what we know about Carthage comes from their enemies. And enemies, as you might expect, are not always the most neutral historians. So when Roman writers describe Carthaginian rituals as dark or extreme, it's worth remembering that they also had a strong incentive to make Carthage seem morally questionable, because nothing justifies destroying a rival city quite like convincing everyone it had bad vibes. Still, there is archaeological evidence that suggests some unusual burial practices, especially involving children. Scholars debate what exactly this means. Was it ritual sacrifice? Was it a form of memorial? Was it something misunderstood over centuries? The honest answer is, we're not entirely sure. And honestly, for bedtime purposes, we're going to let that ambiguity just sit quietly in the background. No need to overthink it. Now, let's drift toward one of Carthage's most famous families, the Barcids. If Carthage was a business, the Barcids were that branch of management that kept saying, we can go bigger. Leading the way was Hamilcar Barca, a general who fought Rome during the First Punic War. He was persistent, strategic, and probably not thrilled with how things ended, because Carthage lost that war. Not catastrophically, not in a dramatic, everything is burning kind of way. Just steadily, frustratingly, and with increasing financial penalties. Rome took control of Sicily. Carthage had to pay a massive indemnity. And overall, it was one of those losses that doesn't destroy you but definitely ruins your mood for the next few decades. Hamilcar, being the kind of person who does not enjoy losing, decided to shift focus. If Carthage couldn't expand in Sicily, then perhaps it could expand elsewhere. So he turned his attention to Iberia, modern-day Spain, and began building a new power base there. More resources, more wealth, more opportunities to quietly prepare for a future rematch. Because, of course, there was going to be a rematch. And this is where young Hannibal enters the picture. Now, Hannibal is often remembered as a military genius. And that's true. But before he became a legend, he was just a child growing up in a very intense family environment. There's a famous story, possibly true, possibly exaggerated, that Hamilcar made Hannibal swear an oath as a boy. An oath of eternal hostility toward Rome, which is a lot to put on a child. Some kids are asked to clean their room. Hannibal was asked to dedicate his entire life to opposing a rising superpower. And, to his credit, He really committed to the assignment. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just picture Carthage at this moment in time. A city of wealth and tension. A place recovering from defeat, but not accepting it. Families positioning themselves for influence. Generals looking toward new horizons. And a quiet, underlying sense that this story is far from over. Let's float there for a second. The ships in the harbor. The markets buzzing softly. The distant conversations about Rome, always Rome. And somewhere, a young boy being told that one day he would carry the weight of all of it. No pressure. We'll pick up from there in the next part, where things remain calm, reasonable, and absolutely not heading toward one of the most famous military campaigns in history. Sleepy history, after all. Just a slow glide toward chaos. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, hopefully a little more relaxed, maybe half listening, maybe drifting in and out, that's perfect. That's exactly where this story works best. No sudden shocks, no loud moments, just a slow unfolding of events that, in hindsight, feel almost inevitable. So, where we left off, Carthage was quietly rebuilding. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily regaining its footing after losing to Rome. And in Iberia, far from the immediate reach of Roman politics, Hamilcar Barca was laying the groundwork for something that looked suspiciously like a second chance. And nearby, a young Hannibal Barca was growing up in what we might gently call a very goal-oriented household. Now, childhood in the Barca family wasn't exactly carefree. There were no lazy afternoons wondering what to do. No find-yourself phase. It was more like, here is your purpose. Please internalize it. And that purpose, according to family tradition, was Rome. There's that story again, the oath. The one where Hannibal, still a boy, is brought to an altar by his father and made to swear eternal enmity toward Rome. Historians debate how literal this moment was, but honestly, even if it's slightly exaggerated, the general idea holds. This was not a neutral upbringing. This was a childhood shaped by unfinished business. And as Hannibal grew older, he didn't rebel against this expectation. He didn't question it. He didn't say, maybe I'll go into trade instead. No, he leaned into it, fully, which in a calm bedtime sort of way is both impressive and slightly concerning. After Hamilcar's death, which, by the way, happened during a campaign in Iberia, because of course it did, leadership passed to Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother-in-law, a man who was, by comparison, a bit more diplomatic, a bit more interested in treaties and city building than constant warfare. He even founded a new capital in Iberia, Carthago Nova. It was organized, strategic, a sign that Carthage wasn't just lashing out, it was planning. But calm leadership, as it turns out, is not always long-lasting in stories like this. Hasdrubal was assassinated, just suddenly removed from the picture. And with that, leadership passed to Hannibal. Still relatively young, still very much shaped by his upbringing, and now in command of an army, which is usually where things begin to escalate. Now, at this point, Rome and Carthage were technically still at peace. Not warm, friendly peace. More like, we are both pretending everything is fine while quietly watching each other. They had drawn boundaries, agreed on spheres of influence, tried to keep things stable. And then Hannibal looked at a city called Saguntum. Saguntum was allied with Rome. It was also located south of the agreed boundary line, which made its status, a bit complicated. Was it protected by Rome? Was it fair game? Depends on who you ask. Hannibal naturally decided to test that ambiguity. He attacked Saguntum. Not quickly, not impulsively, but deliberately. A siege that lasted months. Slow pressure, gradual tightening. The kind of situation where everyone involved knows this is more than just a local conflict. Because once Saguntum fell, Rome had a decision to make. Ignore it and look weak, or respond and start another war. They chose the second option. And just like that, without too much noise, we drift into the Second Punic War. Now, if this were a louder, more energetic story, this is where dramatic music would kick in. But here, we'll keep it soft. Because Hannibal's next move wasn't loud. It was bold in a very quiet, determined way. Instead of waiting for Rome to come to him, Hannibal decided to bring the war directly to Italy. Which sounds ambitious, because it was. But more than that, it was logistically questionable. To get there, he would need to cross multiple territories, avoid or confront various hostile forces, and then there were the mountains. The Alps. Cold. Massive. Not particularly welcoming. And Hannibal looked at them and thought, yes, let's go over those. Because why not double down? So he gathered his army. Tens of thousands of soldiers. Horses. Supplies. And famously wore elephants, which, just pause for a second and imagine explaining this plan to someone. We're going to take elephants over snowy mountain passes. And instead of being stopped immediately, this plan was approved. And it worked. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but it worked. The crossing of the Alps was brutal. Harsh weather, difficult terrain, constant losses. By the time Hannibal reached Italy, his army was significantly reduced. But he had done the impossible. He had arrived, and Rome was not expecting that. Now let's slow down again, because what follows is often told as a series of dramatic victories. And yes, Hannibal did win several major battles. But we're not here for intensity. We're here for the quiet, slightly surreal reality of what this must have felt like. Imagine being in Rome at the time. You've heard of Carthage. You've fought them before. You know they're a rival, but they're supposed to be far away, across the sea. And then suddenly reports start coming in. An army has crossed the Alps. There are elephants, and the general leading them seems unusually competent. That general, of course, being Hannibal. His early victories in Italy were impressive, strategic, sometimes almost unsettling in their precision. He understood Roman tactics. He adapted quickly. He used terrain and timing in ways that caught his opponents off guard. And all the while, he remained calm, not rushing, not panicking, just moving steadily through enemy territory, building momentum. One of his most famous victories came at the Battle of Cannae, a battle that, even now, is studied for its tactical brilliance. But again, we're not going to dramatize it. Instead, just picture the quiet aftermath. The realization on the Roman side that something had gone very wrong. That this wasn't just another enemy. This was someone who understood them perhaps better than they understood themselves. And yet, despite these victories, Hannibal never actually took Rome itself, which might seem strange. Why come all this way when all these battles and not finish the job? Well, war isn't always that simple. Hannibal lacked the resources to besiege a massive, fortified city like Rome. He was far from home. Reinforcements were limited. Support from Carthage was inconsistent, because back in Carthage, things were not entirely unified. Some leaders supported Hannibal fully. Others were cautious, or distracted, or involved in their own quiet power struggles, because of course they were. So Hannibal remained in Italy, winning battles, holding territory, but never quite delivering a final, decisive blow. And over time, the balance began to shift. Rome adapted. They avoided direct confrontation, chose their battles more carefully, focused on wearing Hannibal down rather than defeating him outright. A slower strategy, less dramatic, more patient, and eventually it began to work. But we'll let that unfold in the next part. For now, just rest with the image of Hannibal in Italy. A brilliant general, far from home. Victorious, but not victorious enough. Surrounded by opportunity and limitation. And somewhere, quietly, the realization that even the boldest plans don't always end the way you expect. Hey guys, welcome back. Settle in again. No rush. Maybe you're already halfway asleep. Maybe your thoughts are drifting somewhere else entirely. That's fine. This part of the story actually works best when it feels a little distant, a little hazy. Because tonight we're sitting with a strange kind of situation. A general who keeps winning. A war that doesn't end. And a city, Carthage, quietly watching from across the sea, not entirely sure how to help itself. So, let's float back to Hannibal Barca. He's still in Italy, still moving through Roman territory, still undefeated in the way people like to remember, but also slowly, almost imperceptibly stuck. Because here's the thing about winning battles. They feel decisive, clean, important, but wars, especially long ones, tend to ignore that feeling. After his early victories, including that very uncomfortable Roman experience at Cannae, Hannibal found himself in a position that looked strong, but wasn't entirely stable. He had an army. He had momentum. He had a reputation that probably made Roman generals sigh before breakfast. But he didn't have enough reinforcements. He didn't have siege equipment capable of taking Rome itself. And most importantly, he didn't have full, unified support from back home. Now, let's drift gently back across the Mediterranean for a moment. Because Carthage, the city that started all of this, was complicated. It wasn't a single voice. It wasn't one clear decision-maker saying, "Yes, let's commit everything to this war." It was a collection of councils, wealthy families, political interests, all with slightly different priorities. Some saw Hannibal as their best chance to finally defeat Rome. Others saw him as expensive, or risky, or perhaps a little too independent. And if you've ever seen a group project where half the team is committed and the other half is quietly checking out, you already understand the general vibe. So, Hannibal waited. He requested reinforcements. He hoped for stronger backing. And what he got was limited. Occasional support. Some troops. Some resources. But not enough to turn a strong position into a final victory. Meanwhile, Rome was learning. Slowly. Patiently. A little stubbornly. They stopped trying to defeat Hannibal in direct, large-scale battles because that had gone poorly. Instead, they adopted a strategy of avoidance and attrition. This approach is often associated with a Roman general named Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus. Now, Fabius was not flashy. He was not the kind of general who made bold, dramatic moves. He was careful, which at the time made him deeply unpopular. Because people tend to prefer quick victories. They like the idea of a single decisive moment where everything is resolved. Fabius offered none of that. Instead, he suggested something much less exciting. Let's not fight Hannibal directly, which sounds simple, and also slightly unsatisfying. But it worked. Roman forces began avoiding large confrontations. They harassed Hannibal's supply lines. They limited his ability to gather resources. They made his position in Italy increasingly difficult to maintain over time. And this is where the tone of the story shifts, because it's no longer about dramatic victories. It's about endurance, about waiting, about slowly realizing that being far from home, even when you're winning, can become a problem. Hannibal's army over the years changed. Soldiers were lost, replaced, worn down. His original force, the one that crossed the Alps, gradually faded into something different. Still effective, still disciplined, but not the same. And Hannibal himself remained steady. There are no stories of him panicking, no dramatic breakdowns, just a consistent, almost quiet determination to keep going, which, in a strange way, makes his situation feel even heavier. Because he wasn't failing, he just wasn't finishing. Now, while all of this was happening in Italy, Rome made a decision. If Hannibal couldn't be easily defeated there, perhaps the war could be shifted elsewhere. So they looked toward Iberia, toward the Carthaginian territories that had been built up by Hamilcar and Hasdrubal. And this is where another Roman figure enters the story, Scipio Africanus. Scipio is interesting, confident, strategic, a bit bold, but not reckless. The kind of person who looked at Hannibal and thought, okay, I see what you're doing. And instead of chasing Hannibal endlessly across Italy, Scipio chose a different path. He attacked Carthaginian holdings in Iberia, cutting off resources, disrupting supply lines, gradually dismantling the support network that Hannibal depended on. And then, once that was done, he made a decision that feels almost like a mirror of Hannibal's earlier move. He took the war to Africa, to Carthage itself. Now, pause there for a moment, because this is the turning point that doesn't feel like a turning point at first. No loud announcement, no sudden shift in tone, just a quiet realization in Carthage. The war has come home. And suddenly, all those internal divisions, all those debates about how much support to give Hannibal start to feel a little more urgent. Because now it's not about distant battles. It's about the city itself. And so, Carthage finally does what it had been hesitant to do for years. They call Hannibal back. After more than a decade in Italy, after all the victories, all the effort, all the slow, grinding endurance, he has to leave. Not because he lost, but because the war moved somewhere else. And this part is strangely quiet. No dramatic farewell. No grand conclusion to his campaign in Italy. Hey guys, welcome back. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's perfect. This part of the story doesn't need sharp focus. It's softer, slower, a kind of quiet unwinding after years of tension. So, let's gently return to Carthage. A city that had spent years watching the war from a distance, discussing it in council chambers, funding it, but never fully committing to it, and now, suddenly, feeling it at its doorstep. Because Scipio Africanus had arrived in North Africa. Not loudly, not recklessly, just confidently. He had already taken Iberia, already weakened Carthage's reach. And now, standing on African soil, he did something that feels almost polite in its boldness. He forced Carthage to make a choice: defend the homeland or lose it. And so, after years of operating independently in Italy, Hannibal Barca was called back. Now imagine that moment. Not the dramatic version. Not the one with swelling music and heroic speeches. Just a man returning home after more than a decade away. Older. More experienced. Probably very tired. Carrying the weight of victories that didn't quite lead where they were supposed to. And walking back into a political environment that had never fully supported him to begin with. Because Carthage hadn't changed that much. The same councils. The same cautious leaders. The same quiet disagreements about what should be done next. Only now there was less time to argue. So Hannibal prepares for what will be his final confrontation with Rome. And somewhere nearby, Scipio is doing the same. Now, when two figures like this finally meet, history tends to frame it as something grand. A clash of titans. A defining moment. But if we slow it down, it feels different. It feels inevitable. Like two paths that have been moving toward each other for years, finally crossing. The meeting happens near a place called Zama, a wide, open landscape. Not particularly dramatic. Just space. Room for armies to line up. Room for strategies to unfold. Room for everything to quietly come to a conclusion. Now, before the battle, there's a moment that feels almost surreal. Hannibal and Scipio meet in person. Not as enemies charging into battle, but as two individuals having a conversation. We don't know exactly what was said. Ancient sources give us versions, of course. They always do. But imagine the tone. Measured.
Calm.
Two men who understand war better than most briefly sharing the same space. Perhaps even recognizing something familiar in each other. And then they go their separate ways. Because whatever understanding might have existed, it wasn't enough to stop what came next. The Battle of Zama. Now, we're not going to rush through tactics or formations. We're going to keep it soft. Because what matters here isn't just how the battle was fought, but what it represented. Hannibal had elephants again. Not as many. Not as fresh. But still there. And Scipio had learned. That's the key. Rome, over the years, had adapted to Hannibal's methods. They had studied him, watched him, understood how he thought. And at Zama, that understanding mattered. The elephants were handled. The formations held. The battle didn't collapse into chaos. Instead, it unfolded in a controlled, deliberate way. And gradually, quietly, Hannibal lost. Not in a dramatic, overwhelming sense, but in a way that felt final. Like a door closing. Like a long story reaching its natural end. And afterward, there's no grand escape. No sudden twist. Just the aftermath. Carthage, once again, has to face Rome. And this time, the terms are much harsher. They lose their fleet. They lose territory. They are forced to pay enormous sums over time. And perhaps most importantly, they lose their independence in any meaningful sense. They can't wage war without Roman permission, which, if you think about it, is less of a rule and more of a quiet reminder of who's in control. And Hannibal? He returns to Carthage. Still respected. Still capable. But now operating in a very different reality. He even takes on a political role, attempting to reform Carthage's government, trying to stabilize things, reduce corruption, make the system more efficient. Because of course he does. Even after everything, he's still trying to fix things. But Rome is watching. Always watching. And eventually, they grow uncomfortable with his presence. Not because he's currently a threat, but because he could be, which, in a way, is even more unsettling. So Hannibal leaves again, voluntarily this time, going into exile rather than risk bringing more trouble to Carthage. And from there, his life becomes quieter, moving between different courts, advising other rulers, always a step ahead of Roman attention, until, eventually, that quiet running comes to an end. Faced with capture, Hannibal chooses control. He takes his own life. No spectacle. No final battle. Just a decision. And with that, one of history's most persistent figures fades out. Now, let's drift back one last time to Carthage. Because even after all of this, the story isn't over. The city still stands, weakened, restricted, watching Rome grow stronger. And over time, that uneasy peace begins to feel less like peace and more like a pause. A long pause. One that, as we'll see in the next part, doesn't last forever. For now, just rest there. A city that survived. A general who almost changed everything. And a war that ended, but didn't quite let go. Hey guys, welcome back. At this point, you might be drifting in and out, catching pieces of the story, like waves. That's perfect. This part is softer, but also a little heavier, in that quiet, inevitable way. So let's return, one more time, to Carthage. Not the powerful, confident Carthage from before. Not the ambitious trading empire. This is a quieter version, a city that has been adjusted. After the defeat by Rome, Carthage wasn't destroyed. Not immediately. Instead, it was reshaped into something more manageable, less threatening. A city that could exist as long as it stayed in its place, which, as you might imagine, is not a particularly comfortable way to exist. They paid heavy tributes, year after year, silver flowing steadily toward Rome, a kind of slow, financial reminder of who had won. Their military power was limited, their ability to act independently restricted. And yet, something interesting happened. They recovered, not militarily, not politically, but economically. Because Carthage had always been good at one thing, trade. And even under restrictions, they found ways to rebuild wealth, quietly, efficiently, without drawing too much attention, or at least trying not to. Fields were cultivated, markets reopened, ships returned to the sea, and over time, Carthage began to look comfortable again. Not powerful, but stable. And oddly enough, that stability made Rome uneasy. Now let's drift over to Rome for a moment. Because Rome, at this stage, is growing, expanding, confident, increasingly dominant in the Mediterranean. And within Rome, there are voices. Some practical, some cautious, some a little obsessive. One of those voices belonged to Cato the Elder. Cato had a habit, a very specific habit. No matter what topic was being discussed in the Roman Senate, agriculture, taxes, infrastructure, he would end his speeches with the same line: Carthage must be destroyed, which is a strong closing statement, and also a bit repetitive, but he kept saying it over and over, because in his mind, Carthage's recovery wasn't reassuring. It was dangerous. Even if Carthage wasn't currently a threat, it had been won before. And in Cato's world, that was enough. Now, whether this fear was entirely justified is debatable. Carthage, at this point, was not preparing for war. It was not building massive armies. It was not planning another Hannibal-style campaign. It was minding its business, trying to exist. But sometimes existence is enough to make a rival uncomfortable. And eventually, Rome found its reason. A nearby North African kingdom, Numidia, began encroaching on Carthaginian territory. Small conflicts, border disputes, the kind of tensions that, under normal circumstances, might be managed. But Carthage had a problem. They weren't allowed to wage war without Roman approval. So when these conflicts escalated, they were stuck. Wait for Rome to respond, or defend themselves and technically break the treaty. And at some point, they chose to defend themselves, which, from their perspective, probably felt reasonable. From Rome's perspective, it was a violation. And just like that, the justification was there. Not loud, not dramatic, just convenient. So Rome declared war. Again, this time the Third Punic War. Now this war feels different, not like the earlier ones. There's no Hannibal, no long campaigns across distant lands, no dramatic strategies unfolding over years. This is focused, direct, and in a quiet way, final. Roman forces land in North Africa. They demand concessions. At first, Carthage complies. They surrender weapons. They negotiate. They try to avoid escalation, because at this point they know how this usually ends. But then Rome makes a demand that feels impossible. They tell Carthage to abandon the city, to leave, to relocate inland, to simply stop being Carthage. And that is where something shifts, because there's a difference between losing power and losing identity. And for the first time in a long time, Carthage resists, not as an empire, not as a dominant force, but as a city that refuses to disappear quietly. So they prepare, not for victory, but for survival. Walls are reinforced. Weapons are forged from whatever materials remain. Even everyday objects are repurposed. There are stories, possibly embellished, but still telling, of people cutting their own hair to make rope for siege equipment, which gives you a sense of the mood. Determined, but also aware, because deep down they likely understood the odds. The Roman army, led eventually by Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the earlier Scipio, begins the siege. And this siege is slow, not chaotic, not explosive, just steady pressure. Months turning into years. Supplies dwindling, hope narrowing, and inside the city, life continues in that quiet, strained way that people adapt to difficult situations, trying to maintain normalcy where possible, holding on to routine, even when everything is gradually closing in. And then, eventually, the walls are breached. The Romans enter the city. And what follows is not fast. It's not a single moment. It's a process. Street by street. Building by building. Resistance that fades not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. And Carthage, the city that started with a clever trick involving an ox hide, the city that built a trading empire, the city that raised Hannibal, is brought to an end. Destroyed, not just defeated, removed. And afterward, there's a story, one you've probably heard, that the Romans salted the earth so nothing would grow again. It's dramatic, poetic, and most likely not true, but the idea stuck because it fits the feeling that this wasn't just a victory, it was an erasure. And yet, even that isn't entirely the end, because places have a way of lingering, of leaving traces, of being remembered even when they're gone. And eventually, centuries later, a new city would rise on that same ground. But we'll let that sit quietly for now, because tonight's story, the slow rise, the long rivalry, the almost victory, and the final loss, has reached its natural resting point. So just let it fade out. The harbor empty, the market silent, the idea of Carthage drifting into history. And if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. But if not, that's kind of the goal. Hey guys, welcome back. If you've made it this far, you're either very relaxed or very committed, or maybe just comfortably stuck somewhere in between. Either way, this last stretch of the story is softer, quieter, more like watching something fade and then, unexpectedly, return in a different shape. So, let's drift back to the ruins of Carthage. Not the living city anymore. Just what's left. Broken walls, empty spaces, the outlines of streets where voices used to echo. The harbor, once full of ships, now still. Maybe a few scattered remnants of daily life, but nothing that feels whole. After the destruction at the end of the Third Punic War, this place wasn't just defeated. It was deliberately silenced. And for a while, it stayed that way. Years passed, then decades. People moved on, or tried to. Rome expanded. Its influence stretched farther and farther, becoming something vast and confident and, at times, quietly overwhelming. And Carthage became a memory, a warning, a story told in Rome about what happens to rivals who don't quite disappear when they're supposed to. But here's the thing about places. They don't always cooperate with endings. Because eventually someone looked at that stretch of land, that coastline, that harbor, that strategic position, and thought, this is still a very good location. And that someone was Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar had a habit of seeing potential where others saw conclusions, which, depending on the situation, could be either visionary or slightly unsettling. And when he looked at the ruins of Carthage, he didn't just see the past. He saw opportunity, so he proposed rebuilding it, not as the old Carthage, not as the rival that once challenged Rome, but as a new city, a Roman city. And after his time, because Caesar's own story, as you might remember, had its own abrupt ending, the idea was carried forward under Augustus. And so, Carthage rose again. Slowly, carefully, different. The new Carthage was organized in the Roman style. Structured, planned, integrated into the empire that had once destroyed it. Temples, roads, public spaces, all built with a different identity in mind, but still on the same ground. Which creates a strange feeling if you think about it. A place that once resisted Rome, now fully part of it. A city that had been erased, now restored, but in a way that reshaped its meaning entirely. And over time, this new Carthage grew. It became one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire. Busy again, populated, alive. Markets reopened. Ships returned. People walked the streets, probably unaware, or only vaguely aware, of the older city that had once stood beneath their feet. Life continued. because it always does. Now, as we move further into this quiet ending, it's worth noticing something. The story of Carthage is often told as a rivalry, a conflict, a war that had to end one way or the other. And yes, that's part of it. But there's also something softer underneath. A pattern. Rise, fall, return. Different each time. Never exactly the same, but never entirely gone. Even the name Carthage didn't disappear. It lingered, passed through languages, through histories, through retellings that shaped it in different ways. Sometimes as a villain, sometimes as a victim, sometimes just as a place that once mattered a great deal. And if we drift even further forward, long after Rome itself faded, long after empires shifted and changed and dissolved, the area around Carthage remained inhabited, layer after layer of history building over what came before. Because that coastline, that position, that quiet advantage never really stopped being useful. And so the story doesn't end with silence. It ends with continuity, with transformation, with a slightly comforting realization that even things that seem completely gone often leave something behind. Now let's gently zoom out. No more battles. No more politics. Just the idea of a city, built from ambition, shaped by trade, pulled into rivalry, carried by individuals who made decisions, some careful, some bold, some maybe a little too confident. People like Hannibal Barca, who carried an entire conflict on his shoulders for years and came so close to changing everything. People like Scipio Africanus, who adapted, waited, and shifted the balance in quieter ways. And even voices like Cato the Elder, repeating the same phrase over and over until it became reality. Each one a small part of something much larger. And somewhere at the very beginning of it all, a woman cutting an ox hide into thin strips, claiming a piece of land in a clever, quiet way. It's almost peaceful when you look at it like that. A story that starts small, grows, struggles, fades, returns, and then settles into history. So, if your mind is wandering now, if the details are starting to blur together, that's okay. That's kind of how this story wants to end. Not with a sharp conclusion, but with a slow drift. The harbor in the distance. The outline of a city once gone, then back again. And the feeling that history isn't always about clear endings. Sometimes it's just about what lingers. All right. That's enough for tonight. Hey guys, welcome back. This is one of those final, almost dreamlike stretches where the story isn't really happening anymore. It's more like it's settling, like dust in sunlight. Quiet, slow, easy to drift through. So we're still near the old ground of Carthage. Except now we're not really watching events unfold. We're just sitting with what's left behind. Because after everything, the rise, the rivalry, the wars, the destruction, the rebuilding, what remains isn't just a city. It's a kind of aftertaste, a memory that Rome never quite let go of. Now let's drift over to Rome again. Victorious, expanding, confident, and yet still talking about Carthage, which is interesting, because usually when something is completely defeated, it fades away. It stops being mentioned. It becomes irrelevant. But Carthage didn't do that. Even after it was destroyed, even after it was rebuilt under Roman control, it lingered in Roman thought as something unsettling, almost like a ghost they couldn't quite convince themselves was gone. Roman writers kept returning to it, retelling the wars, reframing the rivalry, sometimes emphasizing how dangerous Carthage had been, other times quietly acknowledging how close things had come to going differently. And in these retellings, Hannibal Barca became something more than just a general. He became a symbol, not always a comfortable one, because Hannibal represented a version of history where Rome didn't automatically win, a version where things could have gone another way. And that idea tends to stick, even in victory. Now, as time passed, Rome changed. From republic to empire to something larger and more complex than it had ever been before. And the rebuilt Carthage became part of that system. A major city again. Important, prosperous, but fully integrated into Roman life. And this is where things get a little quietly ironic, because the new Carthage began to thrive. It became one of the richest cities in the Western Mediterranean, a center of trade, culture, and administration. In many ways, it succeeded again, just not on its own terms. It was no longer the rival. It was the participant. And that shift feels subtle, but it matters, because it shows how power doesn't always erase something completely. Sometimes it absorbs it, reshapes it, turns it into something that still exists but no longer resists. Now, let's float forward a little further, because history doesn't stop with Rome. Empires shift. They always do. And eventually, Roman control weakens. New influences arrive. New cultures layer themselves over the old ones. And Carthage, both the ancient and the Roman version, becomes part of a deeper, more complex history of the region. Not the center anymore. Not the rival. Just one layer among many. And if you were standing there today, looking out over the ruins, you wouldn't see a single story. You'd see fragments. Foundations beneath foundations. Traces of decisions made thousands of years ago, still quietly shaping the ground. Now, as we settle into the final moments of this story, there's something worth noticing. Carthage didn't fail because it was weak. It didn't disappear because it lacked intelligence or skill or ambition. In many ways, it had all of those things. What it didn't have was the ability to outlast its rival. And sometimes in history, that's the only difference that matters. Rome kept going. Carthage didn't. At least not in the same form. And yet it never completely vanished either. Which brings us back to that quiet idea we've been circling around. That history isn't always about clean endings. It's about persistence, about echoes, about the way places and people leave impressions that don't fully fade, even when they're supposed to. So now let's just sit with that for a moment. No more names, no more battles, just the outline of a city that once stood at the center of the world's attention and now exists as a memory layered into the earth. If your thoughts are drifting, that's okay. If the details are blending together, even better. Because this isn't a story that needs a sharp ending. It just slowly dissolves, like the sound of waves against an old harbor that's seen too much and now finally gets to rest. All right, that's really at this time. Sleep well. Hey guys, welcome back. This is the kind of ending that doesn't really feel like an ending. More like The moment after everything has already happened. When the noise is gone, the urgency fades, and all that's left is a kind of soft, lingering quiet. So we're still here, near the old ground of Carthage. But now there's nothing left to resolve. No conflicts waiting. No rivalries building. Just the long, slow passing of time. And time is very good at smoothing things out. What once felt urgent becomes distant. What once felt permanent becomes the story. Now, if you listen closely, not literally, just in that relaxed, half-asleep way, you can almost imagine the layers. The earliest settlement, the clever beginnings, the rise of trade, the ships moving in and out of the harbor. Then the tension, the rivalry with Rome, the long wars, the weight of decisions made by people who probably thought they were acting logically at the time. Because they always do. No one wakes up thinking, "Today I will contribute to the slow collapse of my civilization." It's usually more like, "This seems like a reasonable step." And then enough of those steps, in just the right order, lead somewhere no one quite intended. Now, drift gently through the figures we've met. Hannibal Barca, the boy who inherited a mission before he really had a choice. The general who did almost everything right, except finish the story the way history tends to reward. There's something quietly human about that, to come so close and still not quite reach the end. Then Scipio Africanus, patient, observant, willing to learn instead of react. Not louder than Hannibal, just steadier in a way that eventually mattered more. And somewhere in the background, still repeating his line like a strangely calm echo, Cato the Elder. Carthage must be destroyed. And eventually it was. Not because the phrase itself had power, but because enough people agreed with it often enough for long enough. Which is, in its own way, how most large decisions happen. Not in a single moment, but in repetition. Now, let's soften the focus even more. Because this part isn't really about events anymore. It's about what remains when events stop mattering. Carthage today isn't a threat. It isn't a rival. It isn't even a functioning city in the way it once was. It's a place where people visit, walk through ruins, read signs, take pictures. Try to imagine what it must have felt like when all of this was alive. And maybe they succeed a little. Or maybe it stays just out of reach. Because some things don't fully translate across time. Now, here's a quiet thought to settle into. At its peak, Carthage probably felt permanent. Stable, important, central, the kind of place people assumed would always be there. And yet it wasn't, which doesn't make it meaningless. It just makes it temporary, like everything else. And somehow, that's not as heavy as it sounds. It's almost calming, because it means nothing has to carry the weight of lasting forever. Not cities. Not empires, not even the stories we tell about them. They can rise, matter deeply, and then gently fade, leaving behind just enough to be remembered. So as we let this whole story drift away, from the first quiet arrival of a Phoenician princess, to the bustling markets, to the long, patient wars, to the silence that followed, just notice how it all blends together. No sharp edges anymore. No urgency. Just a soft timeline stretching out and dissolving at the edges. And if your mind is wandering now, if you've lost track of names or places, that's completely fine. Because the point was never to hold onto every detail. It was just to drift through it. And now to let it go. All right. That's truly the end. Nothing left to continue. Just quiet. Good night. Hey guys, if you're somehow still here, this is the kind of ending that barely feels like anything at all. No new events. No new figures. Just a soft echo of everything we've already passed through slowly settling into stillness. So let's return one final time to the idea of Carthage. Not the place itself, just the idea of it. Because at this point, that's really what remains. A name, a shape in history, a story told and retold until it becomes less about facts and more about feeling. Now imagine standing there again, not as a visitor with a guidebook, but just quietly present, the air warm, the ground layered with centuries. The faint outline of structures that once held meaning, now softened by time. No urgency, no sense that anything needs to happen next. And that's the strange thing about history when it's finished. It doesn't end in a loud way. It just stops asking for attention. The people who lived here once worried about trade routes, politics, alliances, all the things that felt urgent and immediate. And now, none of those concerns remain. Not in the way they once did, which doesn't make them unimportant. It just means they've completed their moment. Now, if we let our thoughts drift just a little further, we can notice something else. How many times in this story things could have gone differently? A different decision here. A slightly delayed response there. A bit more support sent to Hannibal Barca at the right moment, and maybe the balance shifts. Maybe Rome struggles instead. Maybe the word Carthage becomes the center of a different kind of world. But it didn't. And that's okay, because history isn't really about perfect outcomes. It's about what actually unfolded step by step, even when those steps didn't lead where people hoped. Now, think about Hannibal again just for a moment. Not as the general, not as the legend, just as a person who carried a very clear purpose for most of his life, to oppose Rome, and then lived long enough to see that purpose quietly dissolve. No final victory, no complete defeat in the way stories usually prefer. Just an ending that didn't quite match the beginning. And there's something almost relatable about that. Not everything resolves cleanly. Sometimes things just taper off. Now, let's widen the view one last time. Because Carthage wasn't the only city like this. It just happens to be one of the clearest examples. A place that rose quickly, mattered deeply, and then slowly became something else. And the world moved on. New centers of power, new stories, new rivalries. All of them at the time probably feeling just as important, just as permanent. And all of them eventually becoming quiet too. So now there's really nothing left to add. No final lesson. No dramatic takeaway. Just a calm awareness that everything we've moved through, from the first clever settlement to the long rivalry to the quiet end, has already settled into place and doesn't need anything more from us. If your thoughts are fading now, let them. If you're barely following anymore, that's perfect, because this is the part where the story stops holding you and you just drift. No tension. No direction, just stillness. All right, that's it. No more parts after this. Just sleep. Hey guys, all right, this really is the quiet beyond the quiet. If you're still here, you're probably not here in a focused way anymore. Maybe the words are just passing through, and that's exactly where this last part lives. So we won't begin with anything new. No new names. No new places. Just a gentle return to Carthage, not as it was, not even as ruins, but as something even softer than that. A memory that no longer needs to defend itself. Because for a long time, Carthage existed in contrast against Rome, measured by it, defined by it, remembered because of it, the rival, the threat, the almost. But now none of that matters anymore. There's no one left to compete with, no one left to convince, no audience waiting to decide who won. Just time stretching out calmly in every direction. And somewhere within that stretch, the outline of a story that once felt very important. Now let's drift for a moment to the people inside that story. All of them in their own time dealing with things that felt immediate, urgent, personal, decisions that had to be made, risks that had to be taken. And none of them knew how it would all settle. They couldn't see the ending we've been slowly moving toward. They couldn't know that centuries later, their lives would be softened into something like this. A quiet narrative, a bedtime story, almost weightless. And maybe that's the strangest transformation of all. That something once filled with tension, conflict, ambition can eventually become calming. Not because those things weren't real, but because time changes the way we hold them. Now let's gently circle back one last time. Carthage began with a small act of cleverness, a thin strip of land, a new start, a quiet ambition that grew into something much larger than anyone probably expected. It became powerful. It became feared. It became a problem that someone else felt needed to be solved. And eventually it was. But even that solution didn't fully erase it. Because here we are still thinking about it, still drifting through it, still letting it exist in this soft, distant way. So in the end, Carthage doesn't need to prove anything anymore. It doesn't need to justify its choices. It doesn't need to win. It just exists as part of the long, slow memory of the world. And that's enough. Now there's really nothing left. No more threads to follow. No more moments to revisit. Just a quiet space where the story used to be active, now resting. If your thoughts are barely holding on to the words, you can let go. If you've already drifted off, then this part is just passing by unnoticed. And that's kind of perfect, because the story doesn't need an audience anymore. It's already complete. All right, now it really ends. No continuation after this. Just stillness.